Dawn, August 1944. German officers stood frozen along a shattered hedgerow as something unthinkable rolled into view, American fuel trucks driving straight into an active battlefield, shells bursting around them, engines roaring through smoke. To the Germans, it looked like madness. To the Americans, it was victory in motion, the fuel that would unleash tanks, speed, and unstoppable momentum. If you want more powerful WW2 stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us. In the summer of 1944, the German High Command faced a reality they had never imagined at the start of the war. Across France, the once feared panzer divisions were no longer the hunters, they were becoming the hunted. Their engines coughed, their mobility collapsed, and their supply lines fell apart behind them. Every retreat, every crossroads abandoned, and every shattered village carried the same frustrating message back to Berlin: the Germans were running out of fuel, and their enemy was not. The Allied breakout from Normandy had detonated a crisis that no German commander could reverse. American and British forces were no longer inching across hedgerows. They were surging, moving with the kind of speed only a fully fueled mechanized army could maintain. Columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, artillery tractors, and support vehicles stretched for miles. They didn't pause for resupply, they carried resupply with them. And behind them came the lifeline that made it all possible: the U.S. Army's rolling ocean of trucks. To German officers trained in doctrines of calculated movement and carefully rationed logistics, this mobility looked impossible. Their own fuel depots had been shattered by Allied bombers. Their supply trains were ambushed. Even the few functioning tank units were forced to retreat simply because they could not power their engines. Every kilometer was a battle against the fuel gauge. The Americans, in contrast, treated fuel as if it were unlimited, and in many ways, it was. The United States had more refineries, more oil, more tankers, and more industrial capacity than the Axis could ever hope to match. The scale alone was staggering: millions of gallons shipped across the Atlantic, pumped through temporary pipelines at the beaches, loaded into drums, cans, and trucks that flowed like a river toward the front. This dominance was not an accident. It was doctrine. American commanders believed in continuous momentum. A unit that slowed down became vulnerable, predictable, and locked in place. A unit that stayed fueled could maneuver, strike, and seize initiative. And so the American solution was simple: if the front moved faster than the supply depots, then the supply depots would move too. German reports from August and September 1944 reflect the same disbelief. Intelligence officers noted that American columns did not wait for fuel, they were constantly refueled on the move. Trucks drove at night. Convoys changed routes daily. They pushed through rain, dust, and artillery fire. Even under air attack, the Americans kept driving. By the time U.S. forces neared the German frontier, one truth had become unavoidable. The war was no longer defined by tanks and guns alone, it was defined by the ability to move them. And for German officers watching their fuel vanish while American mobility grew stronger each day, the contrast was devastating. But this widening gap was only part of the story, because the Americans were about to do something even more shocking, something no German officer expected to see up close. As the Allied advance accelerated across France, the German High Command struggled to understand how the Americans were sustaining such impossible momentum. Their own retreating division sent back frantic reports: towns lost overnight, armored spearheads appearing where no roads existed, and infantry divisions being pushed back by units that seemed to arrive faster than they could report them. What German commanders didn't yet grasp was the full scale of the American logistical machine now bearing down on them. By mid-August 1944, the Allied front had outrun every expectation. The capture of Cherbourg, the breakout from St. Lo, and the collapse of German positions at Falaise turned the Western Front from a static battlefield into a highway of American armor. But momentum created a new problem, one the Germans assumed would stop the Americans cold. The tanks were moving too fast. The supply depots were too far behind. The front had stretched nearly 300 miles beyond the original logistical plans. To the German mindset, this should have triggered an automatic halt. A mechanized army without fuel becomes nothing more than steel scattered across French fields. But the Americans refused to slow down, not even for a day. Instead of pausing for their supply chain to catch up, they pushed the supply chain directly into the battlefield. This decision emerged from a fundamental difference in doctrine. German logistics were centralized, rigid, vulnerable to disruption, and heavily dependent on rail lines. When those rails were bombed or captured, entire armies starved of fuel. The Americans, however, relied on countless trucks operating independently, each capable of rerouting, regrouping, or dispersing at a moment's notice. It was a flexible system, a system designed to survive chaos. This adaptability produced one of the most audacious logistical operations of the entire war, the Red Ball Express. Within days, the U.S. Army assembled nearly 6,000 trucks, all painted with bold red markings, moving around the clock through narrow French roads. But even this unprecedented supply effort couldn't match the pace of advancing Allied armor. The front was simply moving too fast. Which led to the moment German officers would later describe as reckless, illogical, and unbelievable. When fuel shortages threatened to slow the American advance near the German border, U.S. commanders issued an order that no German general would have dared to sign. Fuel trucks would not stay behind the lines, they would drive directly into combat zones. It defied every traditional principle of logistics. Fuel trucks were flammable, vulnerable, and critical to the entire operation. Losing one could cripple a battalion. Losing many could halt an entire offensive. But losing momentum was considered far more dangerous. As desperation grew on both sides, the Americans prepared to make a decision that would stun every German commander who witnessed it, a decision that shifted the psychology of the battlefield and revealed the full magnitude of America's logistical confidence. Angle 1, the human reaction, German shock in real time. When American fuel trucks first rolled toward the front lines under direct enemy fire, the reaction inside German command posts was immediate and emotional. German officers, accustomed to strict logistical discipline, watched through binoculars with genuine disbelief. Fuel convoys were supposed to stay miles behind the front, hidden, protected, and guarded with caution. They were never supposed to appear on the battlefield itself. Yet here they were. Long columns of American trucks, GMC Jimmies, Studebaker 6X6S, and fuel tankers, bounced across shell-torn roads with engines rattling and crews gripping their steering wheels with white knuckles. Dust clouds rose behind them. Artillery impacts flashed near their wheels. Still they kept moving. German observers initially assumed they were ammunition trucks or troop carriers. But once the sun struck the metal tanks and the markings became clear, shock spread through the forward positions. Officers questioned their own eyes. Fuel trucks? Here? Now? Some German accounts described the scene as insanity. Others assumed the Americans were panicking or retreating. But moments later, when the trucks stopped just behind tank formations, the truth became painfully clear. The Americans were preparing their armor to launch another rapid strike, fueled right on the battlefield. German officers realized that what they were witnessing wasn't disorder, it was confidence. The emotional impact was profound. Where the Germans saw danger, the Americans saw urgency. Where the Germans saw reckless risk, the Americans saw essential momentum. And that psychological divide was more dangerous than any tank. Angle 2, tactical logic, why America could risk what Germany could not. To the German army, protecting fuel was a matter of survival. Every liter was rationed, measured, escorted, and stored under guard. One destroyed truck could mean a grounded panzer. One lost depot could stall an entire corps. But the Americans approached the problem with a completely different mindset. For the U.S. Army, mobility was life. Speed was the shield. Momentum was the weapon. American doctrine held that the ability to move quickly was often more important than perfect safety. A moving unit was harder to target. A fast offensive forced the enemy into defensive confusion. And even if losses occurred, the industrial power behind the American war machine ensured they could replace trucks faster than Germany could replace tanks. This thinking created the tactical justification for sending fuel trucks into battle. The cost of losing momentum outweighed the cost of losing vehicles. If tanks ran dry, the attack died. If the attack died, the enemy recovered. And if the enemy recovered, casualties would be far greater than anything a single truck could suffer. Furthermore, U.S. logistics officers had studied the terrain and the German retreat patterns. They knew the Wehrmacht was collapsing faster than it could reorganize. They knew the Germans lacked aircraft to interdict convoys. And they knew that every minute gained before German defenses stabilized gave the Allies another foothold toward victory. This tactical logic was something the German mindset, rooted in limited resources and defensive caution, could not mirror. It was a strategy born from abundance, mobility, and confidence. And the Germans had no answer for it. Angle 3, the technological and industrial edge behind America's impossible mobility. Long before American fuel trucks ever rolled into battle, the foundation of this bold strategy came from something far larger than any single decision. It came from American industry itself. The United States did not win the logistical war by improvisation alone. It won because it possessed the industrial depth to turn ideas into action at a scale the world had never seen. Fuel trucks were only one piece of a vast machine. American factories produced vehicles faster than any army could destroy them. Assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo built thousands of trucks each month. Engines, tires, gearboxes, and fuel tanks moved across conveyor belts non-stop. It was this industrial certainty, this knowledge that every destroyed truck could be replaced tomorrow, that gave commanders the confidence to risk them today. The trucks were also technologically superior to anything the Germans fielded for logistical support. US 6x6 trucks could climb steep French roads, traverse mud, and move at high speeds across terrain that German supply vehicles struggled with. Fuel tankers were reinforced, reliable, and standardized, meaning spare parts were plentiful. And then there were the jerrycans, simple, steel containers copied from the German design but mass-produced to a degree the Axis never approached. Millions were stamped, filled, and stacked. They allowed rapid refueling anywhere, anytime. This technological and industrial edge made American logistics flexible, resilient, and, most importantly, fearless. Every truck, every can of fuel, and every engine coming off those assembly lines pushed the front line closer to Germany. To German officers trained in scarcity, watching such abundance pour into the battlefield felt like witnessing an entirely different kind of war, one they could not hope to match. Angle 4, Leadership Mentality, the command decisions that changed everything. Behind every fuel convoy racing toward the front stood a chain of leaders who refused to let the advance slow down. American field commanders, from corps generals to battalion officers, embraced a leadership culture built on initiative, flexibility, and speed. They were encouraged to act, not wait. To solve problems, not report them. To push forward, even when doctrine said to hold back. The German army admired discipline and precision, but by 1944 that strength had become a weakness. Orders moved slowly. Initiative was restricted. Logistics depended on central approval. And fuel was hoarded, not used aggressively. American leadership believed the opposite. Major General J. Lawton Collins insisted that his 7 Corps must never give the enemy time to breathe. Patton demanded constant movement. Bradley's strategy focused on broad front pressure. And even lower-level officers had authority to redirect convoys, reroute supply lines, and coordinate fuel runs on the spot. This decentralized decision-making meant the Americans could respond to fuel shortages instantly. If tanks needed fuel immediately, commanders didn't hesitate, they called for trucks, escorts, and drivers willing to face artillery to keep momentum alive. The Germans saw recklessness. The Americans saw necessity. To the American command, getting fuel to the tanks was not a supporting task, it was the battle itself. And this mindset, combined with industrial strength and tactical vision, created the moment that would shock the German army more than any maneuver they had yet witnessed. The hills east of Argenton trembled under the thunder of artillery on the morning of August 20, 1944. Smoke drifted across the open fields, broken fences lay scattered, and the distant rumble of tank engines rose and fell like an oncoming storm. American armored units had pushed deep into German lines during the pursuit toward the Seine, but now, after days of rapid advance, the momentum was collapsing. Fuel gauges dropped dangerously low. Sherman sat idling near hedgerows, crews watching their needles hover near empty. If they stopped now, the Germans would have a chance to regroup. Inside a German observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley, officers noticed something unusual. American tanks weren't withdrawing. They weren't setting up defensive positions. Instead, they were waiting, silent, exposed, and vulnerable. To German commanders, this was the first sign of inevitable Allied overextension. Finally, a chance to counterattack. But then the distant sound of engines began to rise, not the roar of tanks, but the steady hum of dozens of trucks. Out of the smoke came long convoys of American fuel carriers, speeding toward the front line with reckless confidence. Fresh dust rose behind them as they moved in tight columns, headlights dark, canvas covers snapping in the wind. Shells burst along the roadside. Machine gun fire crackled from hidden German positions. Yet the trucks kept coming. German officers froze. This was the last thing any of them expected to see. Fuel trucks were the most vulnerable vehicles on any battlefield, flammable, lightly armored, and essential. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near direct combat. But the Americans were not just bringing them forward, they were driving them straight through a contested kill zone. Tank crews along the American line waved them in, guiding them between burning trees and shattered stone walls. Drivers jumped out before the engines even settled, hauling hoses, releasing valves, and fueling tanks right where they stood. There was no hesitation. No caution. Only urgency. To the Germans watching from the ridge, it looked like madness. To the Americans on the ground, it was a race against time. Every second counted. Every gallon mattered. Every truck that reached the tanks brought the front line one step closer to German territory. German artillery crews, stunned by what they were witnessing, opened fire in desperation. Shells fell dangerously close to the convoys. One truck exploded in a massive fireball. Another flipped into a ditch after a direct hit. But more trucks pushed forward, weaving through smoke as if they were part of a battlefield assault. The American tanks, now drinking fuel from hoses snaking across the dirt, roared back to life. Engines growled. Turrets turned. Tracks churned the earth once more. And for a moment, German commanders finally understood. The Americans were not just supplying the battle, they were winning it with their supply. But the true turning point was still coming, when those newly fueled tanks would unleash the full force of their renewed momentum. The moment the last hoses were pulled free and the final tanks sealed their caps, the quiet hesitation that had briefly hung over the American line evaporated. Engines ignited in unison, sending deep booms across the valley. The Shermans, once stranded and vulnerable, were now fully alive again, steel beasts shaking the earth beneath them. Drivers slammed hatches shut. Commanders scanned the horizon. Gunners loaded rounds. Momentum had returned. And the Germans realized it too late. From their ridge position, German officers watched the transformation unfold with disbelief. Just minutes earlier, they believed the American thrust had finally stalled. Their own infantry detachments, scattered and exhausted, had been preparing to reposition under the assumption that the Allied advance was temporarily paralyzed. But instead of slowing, the Americans surged forward with renewed fury. The 1st Sherman platoon hammered into motion, racing across the open fields with tracks ripping through the soil. Dust exploded behind them. Shells screamed overhead. American tank destroyers followed, their crews shouting coordinates and scanning for anti-tank guns hidden among farmhouses and hedgerows. German mortar teams attempted to adjust fire, but it was too late. The Americans were already closing the distance. Behind the initial wave, more fueled vehicles joined the assault, half-tracks filled with infantry, armored cars scouting ahead, and self-propelled artillery rolling into position to suppress German emplacements. The battlefield shifted from tense stillness to explosive movement in minutes. German officers, now aware of how completely they had misjudged the situation, scrambled to reorganize their units. Orders went out to intercept the American push, but coordination was nearly impossible. Fuel shortages meant their armored support was limited. Many of their vehicles had been hidden or abandoned hours earlier. Others were sitting far from the front, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. And now, with American tanks charging forward at full power, the imbalance was overwhelming. One German anti-tank battery positioned near a stone barn opened fire. Their first shot struck the lead Sherman side, carving a deep crater in the armor. But the tank kept moving. A second round missed completely. The Americans responded with a synchronized blast from 3 tanks at once, flattening the position in seconds. The German line began to crack. Every minute gained by the fuel truck's daring arrival now delivered devastating consequences. American armor bypassed roadblocks, crushed through fences, and punched holes in defensive lines that German infantry could not fill. The speed was shocking. The violence decisive. For the German officers watching from the ridge, a chilling understanding settled in. They had witnessed not just bravery, but an entirely new form of warfare, where logistics itself acted as a frontline weapon. The Americans were not simply better supplied. They were weaponizing their supply. They were fighting with movement, fuel, and speed in ways the German army could no longer counter. And as the assault tore deeper into German positions, the psychological damage became as severe as the physical losses. The battle was shifting. The outcome was widening. And the aftermath would leave no doubt about what this moment meant for the future of the war. When the fighting finally eased along the Argentine corridor, the battlefield told a story that German commanders wished they could unsee. Burned-out gun pits, shattered defensive pockets, abandoned positions, each one marked a moment where their forces failed to halt the American advance. And at the center of it all stood the undeniable truth: the Americans had regained momentum faster than any German officer believed possible. Reports arriving at German headquarters were filled with phrases like unexpected acceleration, continuous movement, and pressure intensifying despite fuel risk. Officers tried to explain how the American armored spearhead had surged forward at a pace that defied the situation on paper. But by then, the explanation no longer required debate. Everyone knew why it had happened. The fuel trucks. Their appearance on the battlefield, a place where no logistics officer would willingly send such vehicles, became the defining image of the engagement. German soldiers described watching them roll through artillery fire as something that broke morale more effectively than any tank charge. If the Americans were willing to risk their most flammable assets in direct combat zones, then clearly they were not facing the same desperation Germany faced every day. For U.S. forces, the aftermath was equally clear: their gamble had paid off. The tanks pushed several miles beyond their expected objectives. German strongpoints collapsed. Roads to the Seine opened wider. The pursuit toward Paris gained speed. Commanders praised the drivers whose courage kept the advance alive, noting that without their actions, the offensive might have stalled for days. But the psychological impact was even more significant than the tactical gain. German officers came away from the battle convinced that the Americans fought with a kind of logistical confidence, and even audacity, that the Reich could no longer match. It was not just that the Allies had more fuel. It was that they were willing to use it boldly, aggressively, and fearlessly. And as the German army fell back toward the Seine, one realization spread through every command post: this war was shifting into a contest Germany could no longer win. In the quiet after the battle, long after the tanks had rumbled east and the smoke had drifted into memory, a deeper truth began to settle over the landscape. What happened that day was more than a tactical victory or a bold logistical maneuver. It was a moment that revealed the real engine driving the American war effort. Not just steel. Not just firepower. But mobility powered by fearless logistics. Throughout the war, Germany relied on precision, discipline, and carefully rationed resources. But by 1944, those strengths could no longer overcome the collapse of their supply system. In contrast, the United States fought with a kind of momentum born from confidence in its industry, confidence in its soldiers, and confidence that its supply lines could be stretched, pushed, and even thrown into danger if that meant keeping the advance alive. The fuel trucks that raced into battle were more than vehicles. They were symbols of an army that refused to pause, of a nation willing to risk everything to maintain speed, and of a military doctrine that treated logistics not as support but as strategy. For German officers who witnessed it, the moment was a stark reminder that wars are not won by caution. They are won by the side that can move faster, sustain longer, and push through when the situation demands the impossible. And as history would prove in the months that followed, America's relentless ability to keep its armies fueled, physically and psychologically, became one of the decisive forces that drove the war toward its final conclusion.